The town of Maplewood was known for its quiet charm. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything to go wrong. The streets were always clean, the houses well kept, and the sound of children laughing echoed down the block. It was the type of town where everyone knew everyone, and the sheriff was a familiar, comforting face. Sheriff Tom Callahan had lived in Maplewood his whole life. He didn't speak much about his past, but the townspeople trusted him. He didn't need to prove anything. His presence alone was enough to make people feel safe. He was calm, always measured, and carried an air of quiet authority that made him seem untouchable. But one day everything changed. The roar of motorcycle engines broke the usual peace of the town. A group of bikers had arrived, loud and brash. They didn't fit in here. They weren't interested in blending in, they were looking for trouble. They started revving their engines in the town square, making everyone uneasy. People could feel the tension in the air. Whispers began to spread. These bikers weren't just passing through. Something was different about them, and Sheriff Callahan was about to find out exactly what. Sheriff Tom Callahan was more than just a lawman in Maplewood. He was a figure of stability, a quiet leader everyone could rely on. For years he'd been the rock that kept the small town grounded. His reputation, though not built on grand gestures or loud speeches, was solid. He didn't need to prove himself, because his actions spoke louder than words ever could. He joined the force young, straight out of high school. At first, people thought he was too quiet, too reserved for a sheriff, but over time they realized he had a sharp mind and an iron will. He kept the peace, never rushed to judgment, and never let his emotions cloud his decisions. What few knew was that Sheriff Callahan had a past, one he didn't talk about, and one he worked hard to keep hidden. The people of Maplewood respected him, but they didn't know everything about him. They didn't know that, long before he became sheriff, Callahan had been through a lot. He'd seen the darker side of the world, dealt with men who were far worse than anything this little town had to offer. Yet, he didn't carry himself like a hardened criminal or a military hero. He was just the sheriff, and that was exactly why the bikers were making a mistake. They saw a calm, unassuming man standing before them. But what they didn't know was that Sheriff Callahan's calm demeanor hid a strength and experience far beyond anything they'd ever encountered. The bikers were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. The sound of roaring engines shattered the quiet of Maplewood. It wasn't the usual hum of traffic or the occasional car passing by. No, this was different. A group of bikers rolled into town, their motorcycles echoing off the buildings. Their leather jackets and rough faces were out of place in the peaceful town, and the moment they arrived, the air seemed to thicken with tension. The bikers didn't bother to park their bikes neatly, they just dropped them in the middle of the street, revving their engines for no reason other than to make noise. People stared from their windows, some stepped outside to see what was going on, but no one dared approach them. These weren't the kind of men you could casually walk up to. The group of bikers didn't look like they were here to sightsee. They had that wild, dangerous look in their eyes. Some of them started shouting, causing a scene. One biker kicked over a trash can, while another leaned against a store, blowing smoke in the air like he owned the place. The peace that had always defined Maplewood was slipping away, replaced by a sense of unease. Sheriff Callahan was sitting at his desk when the calls came in. He didn't flinch. He'd dealt with troublemakers before. But this felt different. He grabbed his hat, slipped on his jacket, and walked out to his truck. The town was quiet, but there was a growing sense of dread in the air. As he drove toward the center of town, he could see the group in the distance. They were too loud, too brash, and they were making it clear that they didn't care about the small town rules. They were pushing boundaries, testing the limits, and Sheriff Callahan was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. As Sheriff Callahan approached the group of bikers, he could feel the tension in the air. The sound of their engines reverberated through the streets, filling the space around him. He didn't rush, he took his time, steady and calm, as always. It wasn't the sheriff's style to show fear or anxiety, even when the situation seemed out of control. He had seen too much in his life to let a few loud bikers shake him. The bikers, however, didn't see him the same way. To them, he was just another small-town sheriff, probably too soft to handle their kind. As Callahan stepped out of his truck, they took notice of him. They exchanged looks, sizing him up, and a few chuckled among themselves. They were used to towns like this caving in when they rolled in, but they weren't prepared for what was about to unfold. One of the bikers, a tall man with a patched leather vest, walked toward Callahan. He had a cocky grin on his face, like he was looking forward to messing with the local law. "Hey Sheriff," the man sneered, "what's a guy like you gonna do about us?" His voice was loud, mocking. Callahan didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes steady, his hands resting casually at his sides. He said nothing at first, just surveyed the group, taking in the scene with a calm that unnerved them. "You think you own this town, don't you?" The biker continued, stepping closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you should get out of our way, old man." The other bikers laughed, some slapped their knees, but Callahan remained unmoved. He finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You've come into my town, causing trouble. I suggest you leave before things get worse." The biker laughed again, shaking his head. "You don't scare us, Sheriff, you should be thanking us for bringing some excitement around here." Callahan didn't respond to the taunts, he wasn't here for a verbal battle. The sheriff's face remained unreadable, but something in his eyes told the bikers they had underestimated him. The tension in the air thickened. The bikers were pushing, testing the boundaries, but Callahan wasn't backing down. The taller biker stepped closer, close enough now that they were almost nose to nose. "You really think you can stop us?" he spat, daring Callahan to make a move. But the sheriff's gaze didn't shift. He stood still, unshaken, letting the silence hang between them. The bikers for the first time began to feel the weight of his calmness, and that's when they started to realize something wasn't quite right. The biker who had stepped up to Sheriff Callahan was still grinning, but now there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was used to getting under people's skin, but the sheriff wasn't reacting the way he expected. Most small-town sheriffs would have tried to talk tough or warn them off, maybe even tried to make a show of strength. Not Callahan. He just stood there, silent, watching, letting the biker's words hang in the air. The man leaned in closer, pushing his luck. "What, you just gonna stand there?" he mocked. "Don't tell me you're too scared to do something." Callahan finally spoke, his voice still calm, almost eerily quiet. "You don't know who you're messing with." His words were deliberate, measured. "I've dealt with worse than you." The biker let out a short laugh, not taking him seriously. But the sheriff's eyes didn't leave his. There was something about the way he said it, something that stopped the laughter in its tracks. For a brief moment, the biker hesitated. Something in Callahan's gaze made him pause, unsure of what he was dealing with. "Worse than us." The biker scoffed, but there was a slight edge in his tone now. "You really think you're scaring us?" Callahan took a step forward, not aggressively, but enough to close the distance between them. The sheriff's body language was still relaxed, but there was an undeniable authority in the way he carried himself. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. "I've seen the worst this world has to offer. You think a few loud bikes are gonna intimidate me?" he said quietly. "I've faced men who would have ripped your whole crew apart without blinking an eye." The biker frowned, still not convinced. But now the others were starting to pay attention. The air around them had shifted. It wasn't just a sheriff standing before them anymore, it was something else, something that carried an unspoken weight. They could feel it, but they couldn't quite place it. Callahan continued, his voice low and steady. "This town is my responsibility. I don't take threats lightly, and I don't need to show you what I'm capable of to prove that." The bikers looked at each other, starting to feel uneasy. They had thought they were dealing with a small-town sheriff, maybe someone with a badge, but no real strength. But now, they weren't so sure. They hadn't expected this kind of resolve. One of the bikers, younger and clearly less certain, took a step back. "You're not like the others," he muttered, eyeing Callahan suspiciously. Callahan didn't acknowledge the comment. His gaze was unshaken. It wasn't that he was trying to intimidate them, it was that he didn't need to. The power he carried wasn't in his words, nor in the way he stood. It was in his silence, in the calm confidence that radiated from him. The bikers, once brash and full of swagger, were beginning to falter. They hadn't been ready for this. They'd come here expecting an easy target, expecting to push around a man they thought was just a simple sheriff in a sleepy town. But Sheriff Callahan wasn't just that. And now they were starting to realize their mistake. The bikers shifted uneasily, their previous confidence starting to crack. They'd expected the sheriff to flinch or back down, but instead he stood even taller, exuding a calm authority that felt almost unshakable. The tension in the air was thick now, almost suffocating, and Callahan wasn't helping matters by keeping silent. The others had grown quiet too, unsure of what to do next. The tall biker with the leather vest, who had been the loudest of them all, took a step back, glancing at his crew. It was clear they hadn't expected the sheriff to be this composed. Callahan wasn't just standing there, he was watching them, calculating their every move, reading them in a way that made them feel uncomfortable. He wasn't showing any signs of fear or hesitation. His calmness was unsettling, and the bikers began to second-guess themselves. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" the tall biker said, trying to regain control of the situation. He tried to sound confident, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. He was no longer the one in charge. Callahan's gaze never wavered. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "But if you don't leave, you're going to find out how much I care about my town." The words hung in the air for a long moment. There was something different now, something in the way Callahan spoke. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise, and it felt like one the bikers weren't ready to test. The sheriff took another step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. The bikers took a half step back, then another. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed the sheriff was just some small-town lawman, weak and easy to push around. But now, they were starting to realize they'd made a serious mistake. Callahan wasn't intimidated by them. In fact, he was making them feel like they were the ones out of place. "Get in your bikes," Callahan said, his voice low, but it carried authority. "And leave." For a moment the bikers were still, caught between pride and fear. But Callahan didn't move. His presence was enough to stop them in their tracks. They knew they were outmatched, and it wasn't just because of the sheriff's words, it was in the way he carried himself, in the calm that oozed from every movement, in the silence that seemed to fill the space between them. Finally, one of the bikers, the one who had seemed the most eager to cause trouble, turned and started toward his bike. Slowly the others followed suit, each one casting a reluctant glance back at the sheriff. As they got on their motorcycles, they realized something: they weren't in control anymore. They weren't the ones calling the shots. It was Sheriff Callahan's town. And they had underestimated him in a way they wouldn't forget. One by one, the bikers started up their engines, the roar of the motorcycles filling the air as they turned to leave. The sound was different now, less confident, almost hesitant. They weren't leaving because they wanted to, they were leaving because they knew better than to push their luck any further. As the bikers sped away, Sheriff Callahan stood in the street, watching them go. His posture hadn't changed. He wasn't gloating or basking in a victory. He simply stood there still as a stone, waiting until the last of them was out of sight. The townspeople, who had been watching from their windows and doorways, began to emerge. Some clapped their hands, relieved that the trouble was over. Others whispered among themselves, still in disbelief. They had seen the bikers threaten the sheriff, seen the sheriff stand his ground without flinching, and now they were seeing the bikers leave, their heads low, defeated. Nobody knew exactly what had just happened, but they all knew it wasn't a typical confrontation. There was something different about Sheriff Callahan. Something the bikers had never seen coming. The townspeople exchanged curious glances, but no one dared to ask him what had really taken place. It was clear that Callahan wasn't the kind of man who needed to brag or explain himself. He got back into his truck, his face as calm as it had been the whole time. No celebration, no high fives, just the sheriff doing his job. The town would go back to normal, the people would go back to their routines. But there was a new sense of respect in the air. The sheriff wasn't just a figurehead, or a protector, he was someone who could be relied on, no matter the danger. The bikers had learned that lesson the hard way, and the town of Maplewood had learned it too. Sheriff Callahan wasn't someone to mess with.